Hi everybody, glad you could join me as I continue to work my way through Lee Strobel's The Case for Christ, one chapter at a time. I'm about to review Chapter 2, Testing the Eyewitness Evidence, Do the Biographies of Jesus Stand Up to Scrutiny? And this is really a continuation of Chapter 1. The same expert as Chapter 1 is still being interviewed by Lee Strobel. It's once again, it's Dr. Craig Blomberg. And they're continuing to discuss the eyewitness evidence, which in Strobel's premise is the Gospels. Although, as we discussed in the last video, and as I'll discuss a little bit here, the Gospels really cannot be considered eyewitness evidence, at least for the most part, by any serious standard. But let's just dive into it. A lot of material to cover again. So, as with the previous chapter in the introduction, Strobel begins with an anecdote, and this one is about a young man, a 16-year-old named Michael McCullough. And Michael testified in trial from his hospital bed. He had been shot and paralyzed, and the courtroom, the jury and the judge and the lawyers all sort of crowded into his hospital room, circled his hospital bed, and he testified against the young men accused of shooting him. The defense attorney for the defendants claimed that the shooting was accidental, and they tried to throw some doubt on the testimony of Michael McCullough and the other prosecution witnesses, but ultimately the jury decided that they were deliberately trying to shoot him. They were found guilty and sentenced to 50 years in prison. And shortly after the conclusion of that trial, Michael McCullough died from his injuries. Strobel's point in telling us this story at the beginning of Chapter 2 is that eyewitness testimony, in this case provided by the prosecutors, was subjected to scrutiny by the defense lawyers, and it withstood that scrutiny. And the idea is that true and accurate and honest testimony will withstand that kind of scrutiny, and false or misleading fabricated testimony will be crushed under the weight of that scrutiny. It will be exposed. Now, again, perhaps without even realizing it, Strobel displays his bias for the biblical story and against theories or arguments that question the biblical story. And I declare my bias as well. I'm an atheist. I'm reading this from an atheist perspective. I declare my bias. But Strobel writes the book from the supposed perspective of someone who is just objectively presenting us with the facts, with the arguments, and asking us to make up our own minds. Clearly, that is not what Strobel is actually doing. And one example of that, in a very subtle way, is what he does in the first section of this chapter with this Michael McCullough anecdote. He focuses on McCullough's testimony and tells us how it withstood the scrutiny. The jury believed Michael McCullough despite the defense's attempts to throw doubt on his testimony. But he glosses over the fact that the testimony and the evidence offered by the defense attorneys must have therefore not withstood the scrutiny. It must have fallen under the weight. And it seems to me that if he were really interested in presenting just an honest case and allowing us to make up our own mind, which he repeatedly says that is what he means to do, then he would have presented us or spoken to us about both, about the prosecution evidence which withstood the scrutiny, and also about the defense evidence which did not withstand the scrutiny, which was rejected by the jury, and then invite us to make up our own minds over which of those is the better metaphor for the Gospels. Instead, he attempts to lead us by the nose by addressing only the prosecution testimony that withstood the test, and implying that that same thing happens to the Gospels when we subject them to scrutiny, that like the testimony of Michael McCullough, they too are found to be true when scrutinized. So he proposes 8 tests for the evidence in the Gospels. And the first of those tests is called the intention test. And the intention test is something that will determine whether the writers of the gospel were even trying to write accurate histories. Did they even intend for the gospels to be works of history, to be factual? And Dr. Blomberg says, well, we can assume that the writers of the Gospels intended to record accurate histories because Luke's Gospel opens with a statement of purpose to that effect. And although Matthew and Mark, the other synoptic Gospels, do not include such a statement, they are so similar in style and focus to Mark that we can assume that they had a similar intent to record history faithfully. The problem is, this is basically Blomberg saying, well, yes, the Gospels are intended to be accurate histories because they say so. If a lawyer is interviewing a witness at a trial and he asks the witness, do you intend to tell the truth with your testimony here today? And the witness says yes. Should we even bother cross-examining him? Should we just then assume that everything the witness says is true, no matter how incredible his testimony is or how contradicted by other evidence it might be? Also, remember from chapter 1 that the Gospel of Luke, which contains this statement of purpose that Blomberg cites, is the only gospel which, according to Blomberg's own cited sources, like Papias and Irenaeus, which is not based on the testimony of any eyewitnesses. Luke, by Blomberg's own reckoning, is the furthest from eyewitness testimony of all the four Gospels. And yet that's where his statement of intent to faithfully record the facts comes from. Blomberg also cites chapter 20, verse 31 of the Gospel of John as having another like statement of purpose. And that statement from John is, "These are written that ye may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." Now, Strobel objects, and I have written down here that he helpfully objects, because most of Strobel's challenges or objections to Blomberg's arguments have been in the way of just sort of giving him a helpful nudge toward making another argument. Strobel helpfully objects that this sounds like more of a theological statement as opposed to a statement of journalistic purpose. And Blomberg explains that, well, that still counts because the writer of the Gospel of John would have based his theology on his belief that he was talking about things that were actually factually accurate. And if he didn't believe that what he was writing was actually true, then why would he write it? This raises a question. Does this mean that Blomberg considers it impossible that people could sincerely believe something that isn't true? Blomberg also claims that the Gospels, all four of the Gospels, are written, quote, in a sober, responsible fashion, with accurate incidental details, with obvious care and exactitude. You don't find the outlandish flourishes and blatant mythologizing that you see in a lot of other ancient writings. Now, this raised some eyebrows with me. Blomberg mentions the incidental details that the Gospels get right. He doesn't name specific details as examples of this, and Strobel doesn't ask him for any. But it seems to me that in mentioning just the concept of the Gospels getting incidental details right as helping to establish their historicity, he ignores the many, many instances where we know, or at least can be very, very certain, that they got things wrong. Like, for instance, the non-existent census prior to Jesus' birth, and I'll talk about that more in a few minutes when we get later into the chapter. The contradictory genealogies of Jesus, which I'll also address a little bit more. The conflicting reports of the time of day of the crucifixion. Things like this. These are incidental details that we know the Gospels got wrong. And as for this business of the Gospels being written with sobriety and responsibility, without the kind of blatant mythologizing or outlandish flourishes that we see in other ancient writings, here are just a few examples of blatant mythologizing or outlandish flourishes in the Gospels. Following his baptism, a voice from heaven addresses Jesus, saying, according to the account in Matthew, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." Later, Jesus goes into the desert. In fact, I think it's right after the baptism. He goes into the desert for 40 days, and he is tempted by the devil, who takes him to the top of a mountain that is high enough that he can see the entire world, all the kingdoms of the world, and the devil promises Jesus power over these kingdoms if only he will serve him instead of God. And then after the devil leaves, Jesus emerges from the desert, and he is nursed back to health after his 40-day fast in the desert by angels. And there's no possible eyewitness other than Jesus himself to any of this. A commenter on one of the previous videos pointed that out, that the account of Jesus in the desert is not based on any possible eyewitness account. There's the transfiguration. Jesus is transfigured. He is seen shining with bright light, and the figures of Moses and Elijah appear next to him. And then, following the crucifixion and the death of Jesus, Jerusalem is struck by an earthquake, and dead saints, dead Jewish saints, are said to rise from their graves and roam the streets of Jerusalem and appear to many people. Added to these specific examples, and I could cite more, consider also the presence of mythic universals in the gospel narratives. These are elements that are found commonly throughout myths of all cultures and all across the globe, all throughout history. And there are many elements in the Jesus story in the Gospels that we also find in ancient Egyptian mythology, or in ancient Greco-Roman mythology, or Aztec mythology, or Maya mythology. The list goes on. They're called mythic universals, and they include things like the birth of Jesus was foretold in the stars, the Star of Bethlehem. Jesus was miraculously conceived and birthed by a virgin. He is a descendant of royalty. He's called the Son of God. He's said to have died under atypical circumstances, on top of a hill. And after his death, he visited the underworld. These are all elements commonly found in mythology. And they are exactly the kind of blatant mythologizing that Blomberg says are not found in the Gospels. Now they move on to answering some objections to Blomberg's handling of the intention test. Strobel challenges Blomberg's claims by proposing what he calls a competing and contradictory scenario. And in Strobel's proposed scenario, the followers of Jesus were convinced of his imminent return, and therefore they took no pains to record any records of his life or his teachings. They thought he was coming right back after he ascended to heaven. So they didn't even bother writing any of this down. Blomberg argues that premise is overstated, and he claims that the Gospels record teachings of Jesus, most of which seem to presuppose a long period of time having to pass before the second coming and the end of time. And also, Christianity is an offshoot of Judaism, and Judaism had long been in the habit of both recording the words and actions of people that they considered prophets, and also in continuing to wait for the coming of the Messiah, who was indeed a very long time coming. And once again, Blomberg's answer to this challenge is basically to say, well, that's not what the Gospels say they did. You know, Strobel makes this really, really weak challenge, and Blomberg's response is to say, well, that's not what the Bible says. And also, if Strobel seriously wanted to scrutinize this testimony, to really put it to the test, there are surely more challenging scenarios he could have come up with than the one that he proposes. The possibility that the Gospels were largely or even entirely invented long after the time of the events they supposedly depict is never even mentioned in this chapter. It's mentioned very briefly in chapter 1 and then quickly disposed of and never mentioned again. He also never brings up the opinions of the many New Testament scholars who believe that this sort of late invention is precisely what happened. So then Strobel challenges Blomberg with another scenario. He says, since early Christians believed that Jesus, after his death, continued to speak to them from the afterlife in the form of visions and prophecies. And these messages from Jesus were considered to be just as important and just as authoritative as the words he spoke to them when he was alive. It's possible that these two things were mixed up in the writing of the Gospels, and that sometimes they were quoting Jesus something that he said while he was alive, and sometimes they're quoting Jesus as something that he said to somebody through a vision after his death. And that given that, it's impossible to know what the gospel writers are actually quoting, whether it's the actual historical living Jesus or a vision of Jesus. Blomberg counters that this isn't likely because the New Testament always makes a clear distinction between the quoted words of Jesus and messages received by the writer or someone else through prophecy. He cites the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians making this distinction, and he also mentions the book of Revelation, where, quote, Blomberg saying, one can clearly distinguish the handful of times in which Jesus directly speaks to this prophet, traditionally assumed to be John the Apostle, and when John is recounting his own inspired visions. And then Blomberg cites Paul's criteria, again citing 1 Corinthians chapter 14, Paul's criteria for evaluating prophecy. And quote Blomberg, drawing on Paul's Jewish background, we know that the criteria for true prophecy would have included whether the prediction comes true and whether these new statements cohere with previously revealed words of the Lord. Here's the first thing I noticed about this. Revelation recounts events that would have taken place long decades after the death of Jesus on the cross. Blomberg claims that the writer of Revelation, whoever he was, made a clear distinction between his visions and, quote, the handful of times in which Jesus directly speaks to him, ignoring or forgetting, it seems to me, the fact that any time in the book of Revelation that Jesus is quoted as directly speaking to John, they are by definition the words of John's vision of Jesus, because Jesus is dead. Jesus has been dead for decades, even if you believe the gospel accounts. So any quotes of the words of Jesus, if you ever had one of those Bibles where they have the words of Jesus in red, all the red text, all the red letters in the book of Revelation are quoting dead Jesus, not living Jesus. There can be no distinction between John's prophetic visions and the words of Jesus. It's all the same thing. As to whether or not the prediction coming true is a criteria for testing prophecy, and this again, this assumes you believe there is such a thing as prophecy. If the ultimate truth of a prophecy is important, then we can not only feel free to question the prophecies of John's vision of Jesus in Revelation, but also some of the prophecies that were supposedly shared by Jesus with his followers while he was still alive. For instance, in the book of Luke, chapter 21, verse 32, Jesus says, quote, verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled, meaning the end of the world, the final judgment, the second coming, all of the stuff that Christians are still waiting for. Jesus said, this generation shall not pass away until all has been fulfilled. That was 2,000 years ago. Moving on finally to the next test. This is the ability test. And what this is even by most conservative biblical scholarship, even by that reckoning, at least 30 years passed between the death of Jesus and the time when the gospel accounts were written down. Is it really reasonable to assume that the life and teachings of Jesus were accurately preserved for that at least 30-year interval? Did the followers of Jesus even have the ability to do that? Well, Blomberg argues that committing the oral tradition of the Gospels to memory and preserving it accurately until it was finally written down would have actually probably been no big deal for many of the followers of Jesus, because Back then, books were relatively rare, and most learning was done by rote, by word of mouth and memorization. So people were more accustomed to that back then. Aiding in this process, according to Blomberg, is the fact that many of Jesus' teachings and sayings were passed down in poetic form, making it easier to memorize them with the meter and the repetition and so forth. He also says that the amount of variation that we find between the Gospels, and he estimates between 10 and 40% variation between the various Gospels, matches the rate of variation we find in the telling of other orally preserved sacred traditions from other cultures in the Middle East and throughout the world. That's the expected rate of variation as the story is told and retold. Blomberg argues against comparing the oral tradition which preserved the Gospels to the telephone game, where one child whispers something into someone's ear and they go down the line whispering it to the next person, and by the time it gets to the end of the line it's completely distorted from what the first thing was. Blomberg says that's not what happened with the telling and retelling of the gospel stories, because the process in that case was self-correcting. The community hearing the stories told would ensure that the storyteller was telling them properly, and they would step in and make corrections if they detected something wrong in that telling of the story. Now, does this mean that Craig Blomberg, New Testament scholar, considers other forms of traditional information to be historically reliable as well? Because if, as Blomberg says, of cultures that maintain oral traditions, quote, there were always fixed points that were unalterable, and the community had the right to intervene and correct the storyteller if he erred on those important aspects of the story, doesn't it mean that the Hadith, which is the collection of the sayings and actions of Muhammad that was preserved through oral tradition by early Muslims before finally being written down, is entitled to the same respect as the Gospels? What about the oral traditions of those other cultures I mentioned a moment ago? What about the myriad tribes of Native Americans who lived on the continent on which I am standing before European colonization, who maintained their creation myths and their legendary heroes by passing those stories down by word of mouth from parents to children for untold generations? Would Dr. Blomberg claim that the ancient stories of the Cherokee or the Iroquois are historically reliable as well? I suspect that he would not, especially when those stories can be shown to contradict a claim made in the Bible, in the New Testament especially. So the question then becomes, what reason is there for giving special privilege to the stories, the oral traditions preserved in the Gospels? We now come to the character test. Were the Gospel writers truthful, or is there evidence that they were dishonest and deceitful? Should they be trusted? Blomberg says, well, we simply do not have any reasonable evidence to suggest they were anything but people of great integrity. And as evidence for their character, Blomberg also cites the, quote, grisly deaths which 11 of the disciples, according to him, met at the end of their lives, thus further demonstrating their stellar characters. They were willing to die for their beliefs. Once again, Blomberg is using circular reasoning. This is, I believe, the third time since I've started reviewing this chapter with you that we have caught Blomberg in circular reasoning. Always unchallenged by Strobel, always unnoticed, I would say, by Strobel. Even if we assume traditional authorship of the Gospels, we have no information about the Gospel writers themselves, including the circumstances of their deaths, other than what we find in the Bible itself and through various church traditions. And the argument basically boils down to the people who wrote the Gospels were of honest and reliable character because the Gospels say they were. And this is just laughable. The consistency test is next. And it basically asks the question, aren't the various accounts of the Gospels too contradictory to be trusted? Well, Dr. Blomberg acknowledges that there are disagreements among the Gospels, quote, all the way from very minor variations in wording to the most famous apparent contradictions. However, he believes that once we allow for the expected variations as a result of them being preserved as an oral tradition, that 10 to 40% I talked about a few moments ago, then actually the Gospels are extremely consistent with each other. And then Lee Strobel, the objective journalist that he is, who just wants us to make up our own minds after seeing the evidence, points out that if the Gospels were in total agreement with each other, that would have been used as evidence against their authenticity. So he and Blomberg both agree that the amount of disagreement between the Gospels that we see now is actually a good reason to accept them as reliable histories, because we wouldn't want them to be exactly in agreement with each other. Strobel then presents Blomberg with a few examples of biblical inconsistencies in the Gospels, and Blomberg dispenses with two of these relatively minor inconsistencies pretty quickly. There's the question of the disagreement in Matthew and Luke over whether a centurion personally asked Jesus to heal his servant or whether he sent a Jewish elder to ask Jesus. And then there's also disagreement over the site of Jesus sending the demons into the swine and then the swine running off the cliff into the sea. As found in Mark and Luke, that took place at a place called Gerasa, and in Matthew it took place at a place called Gadara. And Blomberg makes excuses for these inconsistencies and explains them away. And what struck me about that was these strike me as the exact kind of minor disagreements that we would expect to find as a part of that 10 to 40% variation due to the oral tradition. It's just the sort of thing that Blomberg just told us to expect. So I wonder why he even took the time to offer explanations for it instead of just chalking it up to the oral tradition. Then they tackle the famous disagreement over the genealogy of Jesus. And Blomberg attempts to dispense with this one as well. And he suggests two possible explanations. Because, you know, the major one of, there are two genealogies of Jesus, one in Matthew and one in Luke, and they don't match up very well. And in fact, they even have different names for Jesus's paternal grandfather. One says that Joseph's father was named Jacob, and one says that Joseph's father was named Heli. Blomberg explains this by suggesting that first, perhaps Matthew is tracing Joseph's lineage, and Luke is tracing Mary's lineage, but Mary is just left out because tradition at the time encouraged people listing genealogies to leave out women and only list males back down the line. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that Luke is recounting Joseph's physical lineage, his human lineage, his biological lineage, and Matthew is referring to his legal lineage, and that Jacob was his biological father, but Heli was his adoptive father after Jacob died. And then Blomberg also cautions us to remember that names might have been omitted from these genealogies, which would have been perfectly acceptable by the standards of the time, and that names might have been misspelled or mistranslated. Mathot and Mathan, I think, is an example of that. And then at the end of the section, Strobel acknowledges that the explanations of the contradictions, quote, might not be airtight, but there are at least some rational explanations. But this is not the point. Some rational explanations will not do. We don't just want a possible explanation. We want the best explanation for these contradictions. And given what we know is the best explanation for these disagreements between the Gospels, one of Blomberg's explanations, and it seems to me that neither of these would really suggest themselves unless we were beginning with the desire to establish the Gospels as historically reliable. So is it one of those, or is it just that the Gospels, for whatever reason, simply got it wrong? Blomberg also suggests that we should give the Gospels the benefit of the doubt, because he has examined the Gospels, of course, he's studied them as a New Testament scholar, and he's found them to be trustworthy in other areas. And he said we should just hold our judgment in abeyance in this case, and just trust that the Gospels are true, because they've proved themselves in so many other ways. But using the methods and standards by which Blomberg has established the trustworthiness of the Gospels, we can also establish the trustworthiness of the Quran, of the Book of Mormon, of the sacred traditions of various American Indian tribes, of the scriptures of various forms of Buddhism, of the Vedas and the Upanishads and the other Hindu scriptures, and the list goes on and on. Does Dr. Blomberg give these texts the same benefit of the doubt as he gives the Gospels when they exhibit contradictions? Does he make excuses for why we should accept their incredible claims, their questionable history? Again, I suspect that he does not. He unfairly privileges the Gospels. Appropriately enough, after that, we go to the bias test. And the bias test asks, did the Gospel writers have any biases or vested interests that would have compelled them to skew their accounts of the life and the teachings of Jesus? Now, Dr. Blomberg concedes that the sort of love and devotion which the disciples, Jesus' followers, had for him could potentially have resulted in unreliable accounts of his life, but he says that that same devotion could also have compelled the Gospel writers to record the life of Jesus with great accuracy in order to preserve what actually happened and to honor him and show their love for him in that way. And he says, quote, "That's what I think happened here." And then again, he brings up the martyrdom of the disciples as evidence of their being trustworthy people. But why does Blomberg think that their love and devotion for Jesus compelled the Gospel writers to make an accurate account? He says, well, that could have happened, and I think that's what did happen. But why? It's not enough to just say that it's possible that their love for Jesus inspired them to write accurate histories. We need a reason to think that that is actually what happened. Why should we believe that their devotion drove the followers of Jesus to record accurate histories of his life and his preaching, but not believe the same about the followers of Muhammad or the members of the Heaven's Gate cult who, like the disciples, died for their beliefs? And speaking of the martyrdom of the disciples, which Blomberg brings up repeatedly in this chapter, there's little evidence outside of the New Testament and church traditions that these martyrdoms even took place. And Blomberg and Strobel have first to make the case for those martyrdoms before those martyrdoms can become a compelling part of the case for Christ. The cover-up test. People giving testimony will often shade that to place themselves in the best possible light or to leave out or gloss over difficult to explain details. So is there evidence that the Gospel writers did this, thus casting doubt on the truth of their accounts? According to Dr. Blomberg, the Gospels are actually filled with difficult and embarrassing details that the writers would have probably left out if they had felt at liberty to do so. For example, Blomberg cites passages in Mark and Paul's letter to the Philippians that limit the power of Jesus, which might be better off being left out if the church was trying to promote a Jesus that was all-powerful. And Blomberg also cites the baptism of Jesus, and Jesus calling out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" while he was on the cross, as things that just raise questions that could have just been left out of the Gospels and avoided those questions being raised. And once again, hard-boiled reporter Lee Strobel helpfully prompts Blomberg to also mention the sometimes less than flattering portraits of the disciples. Blomberg tells Strobel, quote, "But here's the point. If they didn't feel free to leave out stuff when it would have been convenient and helpful to do so, is it really plausible to believe that they outright added and fabricated material with no factual basis? I'd say not." So let's think about this. The fact that Joseph Smith didn't invent a more plausible explanation for where the Book of Mormon came from when he obviously could have means that we should believe the story about him being visited by the angel Moroni and finding the engraved gold plates and the magic stones that allowed him to translate them. And after all, let's not forget about the Book of Mormon. A total of 11 witnesses testified, swore that they had seen and handled those plates. 8 of them swore they had actually handled the plates, and 3 of them claimed that they were shown the golden plates of the Book of Mormon by an angel, and they heard the voice of God assuring them of their authenticity. Why would these witnesses testify to these occurrences if they weren't actually true? And you know, the early Mormons faced a great deal of persecution and hardship as a result of their beliefs. Can we really be so quick to dismiss their faith when so many of them were willing to suffer for it? As for whether or not the gospel writers deliberately added material to the gospels that had no factual basis, my question is, why is willful fabrication the only explanation for the presence of fabricated material in the gospels? Blomberg sets up this either-or proposition where either the gospel writers intentionally lied or their accounts are totally trustworthy. And it seems to me that this is a false dichotomy. What about the possibility that fabricated material found its way into the Gospels naturally, over time, as a result of legend and folklore creeping in, or innocent, maybe unintentional mistakes in retelling the stories or recopying the texts once they had been written down? Additions to the texts by writers other than the original authors. In fact, we know, or at least have very good reason to believe, that these sorts of things happened to create the stories we find in the Gospels today. One of the most famous New Testament stories of all, the story of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery, where Jesus says, "Let he that is without sin cast the first stone." That was probably added to the Gospel later, after the bulk of it had been written. And given that we know that things like these happen, given that we are susceptible to these kinds of corruption and legend making even today, when preserving accurate records of events is far easier than it was in the time of Jesus, and that we can identify specific passages, like the account of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery, in the Gospels, where things like mythology and errors and late revisions or late additions are probably present, isn't this a more plausible explanation than either side of Blomberg's false dilemma? The Gospel writers, whoever they were, weren't necessarily willful liars, but that doesn't mean that we should just assume that the Gospels as we have them today should be totally trusted as reliable truth. The phenomenon that I've just described not only could account for the Gospels, I think that they make for a much more plausible explanation than either of Blomberg's possibilities. Now we come to the corroboration test. Do the people, places, and events mentioned in the Gospels check out with historical facts when they can be independently verified? Well, Blomberg claims that archaeology has repeatedly confirmed details mentioned in the New Testament. He admits that sometimes archaeology has created more problems, but that these instances are just a tiny fraction of the overall findings of archaeology related to the Bible. And there are many instances where archaeology has confirmed the Gospels. He also claims that there are non-Christian sources that can verify many details that we find in the Gospel stories about Jesus and his followers, despite the fact that Jesus and his disciples do not fit any of the categories that traditional history writers in the ancient world would have valued. For instance, Jesus was not a political ruler. He was not part of a military battle. He was not an official religious leader. And he was not part, Blomberg says, of a major philosophical movement. Blomberg glosses over the times when archaeology has disproven the Gospels and the serious obstacles to accepting the Gospels as historically reliable that remain. For example, as mentioned before, the census that was the motivation for Mary and Joseph to travel to Bethlehem where Jesus was born is not found in any historical records of the time. And there's no reason to think that it ever occurred except for the fact that it is mentioned in the Gospels. There's also the Herod's massacre of the infants in Bethlehem after the birth of Jesus. There's no record outside of the New Testament of that ever happening. In addition, there's no record of Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate. There's no mention in contemporary accounts of the earthquake that supposedly shook Jerusalem after Jesus died during the crucifixion. And there's no mention of all those dead Jewish saints that woke up, emerged from their graves, and were encountered by many in the city. Nobody ever mentioned that outside of the Gospels. Strange. Also, about these non-Christian sources, none of the non-Christian sources cited by Blomberg, or alluded to by Blomberg, because he doesn't name any of them, but they're named by many other Christian apologists. The non-Christian sources are flogged quite a lot. None of them date to the life of Jesus. None of them are eyewitnesses. They're all reporting hearsay, and most of them aren't even describing Jesus. They're describing things that Christians at the time were known to believe, and they offer really no independent verification of the life of Jesus or the claims about him. Now we come to the adverse witness test. Were there others present who could have contradicted or corrected the Gospels had they been distorted or false? Dr. Blomberg says that there were many people at the time who had good reasons to want to discredit Christianity and would have done it if it were possible to do so. And later Jewish writings refer to Jesus as a sorcerer, but in doing so they also acknowledge that he did work miracles. And Strobel asks, could this Christian movement have taken root right there in Jerusalem, in the very area where Jesus had done much of his ministry, had been crucified, buried, and resurrected, if people who knew him were aware that the disciples were exaggerating or distorting the things that he did? And Blomberg replies, quote, I don't believe so. If critics could have attacked it on the basis that it was full of falsehoods and distortions, they would have, but that's exactly what we don't see. Blomberg mentions the opinions of later Jewish writers, thinking Jesus was a sorcerer, but the opinions of these later Jewish writers are utterly irrelevant. They were not witnesses to the life of Jesus, therefore anything they could have to say is just hearsay. It's not part of any eyewitness testimony, which this chapter is supposedly devoted to examining. And it just doesn't matter whether they thought the guy was a miracle worker or not. They lived in a time of overwhelming ignorance and superstition, and believing that a miracle worker was empowered by the devil instead of God seemed a perfectly reasonable thing for them to believe. It doesn't testify to the authenticity of the supernatural claims about Jesus at all. And it also has nothing to say about whether miracle workers or the devil or God even exist. As to the question of how Christianity could possibly have caught on in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas if it had been based on false information, or if people in the area had known that the disciples were making things up or exaggerating. We can dispose of this by simply transferring Blomberg's argument from Christianity to another religion. Suppose Strobel had asked this question of Blomberg instead. Could this Latter-day Saint movement have taken root right there in the state of New York, in the very area where Joseph Smith was known to be a con artist and had even been brought to trial for fraud, if people who knew him were aware that he and his followers were exaggerating or distorting the things that he did? If the answer to this question does not persuade you of the truth of Mormonism, then why should Blomberg's answer to Strobel's actual question persuade you of the truth of the Gospels? And in conclusion, Strobel has a section called A Faith Buttressed by Facts. He wraps up the chapter by reiterating how convincing he finds the evidence offered by Dr. Blomberg. And then he asks Blomberg how his work has affected his own faith. And Blomberg says that his faith has been strengthened by his research into the New Testament, and that even though, according to him, evidence cannot compel faith, Blomberg says, quote, there are plenty of stories of scholars in the New Testament field who have not been Christians, yet through their study of these very issues have come to their faith in Christ. And Strobel places himself in that category, calling himself, quote, a skeptic, an iconoclast, a hard-nosed reporter on a quest for the truth about this Jesus who said he was the way and the truth and the life. A hard-nosed reporter, a skeptic. You know, Blomberg says about he mentions the many New Testament scholars who were brought to Christianity through their studies. There are also plenty of stories of scholars in the New Testament field who were even drawn into that field because they were already Christians. And as a result of their studies, they came to reject their faith in Christianity. And Bart Ehrman is a great example of just that sort of thing. But leaving that aside, the number of non-Christian scholars persuaded to become Christians by studying the New Testament is irrelevant for another reason. Think of the scholars in other fields who, after careful study, have decided that 9/11 was an inside job, or that the moon landings were a hoax, or that someone other than Lee Harvey Oswald murdered John Kennedy, or that there's no law in the United States Code requiring people to pay federal income tax, or that climate change is not occurring, it's fabricated by scientists for some reason, or accepted any of countless other conspiracy theories. There aren't many such scholars, but they do exist. And does the mere fact that some scholars in some fields have been persuaded of these things speak to the truth of those claims? Finally, Blomberg says evidence cannot compel faith. So I close today by asking, if evidence cannot compel faith, of what use is faith? That's it for this one. Next time we go on to Chapter 3, and Lee Strobel interviews another expert, and their subject is the documentary evidence. Were Jesus' biographies reliably preserved for us? That's in the next video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Love to hear your comments, questions, what have you. Thanks for paying attention and being interested in this, and I'll see you next time.